Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Thank you for joining us. I'm Hannah Johnston. I'm a product coordinator here at BookNet Canada, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Monique Mongeon, who is a project manager here. Welcome to our webinar, Emerging Trends, Book Subjects on the Move in the Canadian Market. Before we get started, I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we're on today. This is an acknowledgement that's deeply personal due to this virtual platform and the wide range of locations people are joining from today. Today, I'm broadcasting from the traditional territories of the original nations of this land. The Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat Indigenous peoples. I encourage you to visit the nativeland.ca website to learn more about the people whose land you are joining from today. BookNet Canada endorses the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada and supports an ongoing shift from gatekeeping to space making in the book industry. In spirit of that acknowledgement, I'd like to confirm our responsibility in mending the sacred hoop with Canada's Indigenous peoples, to be an ally to all Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and to unite and work alongside one another. If you're having any difficulties with Zoom or having tech-related questions, please direct your questions to tech support in the chat, and you can find this option by using the drop-down menu above the chat text box. Or you can send an email to techforum@booknetcanada.ca. We're providing live ASL and closed captioning for this presentation. To see the captions, please find the live transcript button in the Zoom menu at the bottom of your screen. Click on it and choose Show Subtitle. If during the presentation you have questions for us, please use the Q&A panel found in the bottom menu. Lastly, we'd like to remind attendees of the Code of Conduct. Please do be kind, be inclusive, be respectful of others, including of their privacy, be aware of your words and actions, and please report any violations to techforum@booknetcanada.ca. Please do not harass speakers, hosts, or attendees, or record these sessions. We have a zero tolerance policy. You can find the entire code of conduct at techforum.booknetcanada.ca/code of conduct. So with that intro done, let's get on to the webinar. So today I'm joined by Mo. Hi, Mo, if you want to say hi, introduce yourself.
Hello, nice to see everybody today.
So today we're going to be going over some of the trends that we've been noticing in sales data over 2021, things that are emerging in terms of subjects that are seeing a lot of movement and are kind of up and coming. So the first thing that we're going to talk about today is comics and graphic novels. According to our Canadian Leisure and Reading Study in 2020, 21% of Canadian adult readers read comics or graphic novels, and this is up from 19% the year prior. In 2021, we saw an increase in units sold in all age categories for comics and graphic novels. Adult comic and graphic novel sales increased 61% in 2021 over 2020. Juvenile comics increased by 12%, and young adult comics, which is that small bar on the far right, increased by 76%. The increase in sales was more pronounced when comparing the first half of 2020 to the same period in 2021. Adult comics and graphic novels increased sales by 82% in the first half of the year, and only 33% in the second half. Juvenile comics sales increased by 49% in the first half of 2021, and actually decreased by 7% when comparing the second half of the 2 years. There are a few things that could have contributed to this discrepancy we're seeing. One is that several popular juvenile comic series, including Cat Kid, Dogman, and The Babysitter's Club, all had titles released in the latter half of 2020. And this boosted the sales figures in that category and accounts for some of the difference in sales that we're seeing indicated here. Young adult comics and graphic novels follows the trend we see with the adult category, although with slightly less of a difference between the two halves of the year. We saw a 72% year-over-year increase in the first half of the year, and a smaller 44% increase in the second half. So far we've been looking at the general comics and graphic novels category, but there is one subcategory that's responsible for a majority of the sales, and that's manga. So sales of general and trade manga titles have been consistently trending up year after year, with an increase in sales of 106% from 2016 to 2020. In 2021, the growth of general manga sales actually turned exponential, and we surpassed the total sales in 2020 by 93% in 1 year. Many manga titles marketed to young adults are classified under the general subject heading in Bizac. So the number of young adult fiction, comics and graphic novels, manga titles that we're seeing is quite small in terms of the ISBN count. However, the market for young adult manga titles is growing, and manga for young adults saw similar growth in 2021 when compared to the adult category, increasing 206% over the year prior. The market for juvenile manga titles is significantly bigger than its young adult counterpart in terms of ISBNs, and is historically more popular as a Bizac. And we saw a similar growth trend in juvenile fiction, comics and graphic novels / manga, with the units sold growing 82% from 2020 to 2021. So with all that data, there's no question that the manga subject category is on a roll in 2021 after steady gains over the past 5 years. Sales of general trade, young adult, and juvenile manga titles were all on the rise again last year. And we thought it would be interesting to get a look at some Google Trends data to kind of see how this interest is represented. And we see that in the Google searches performed by Canadians in 2020 and 2021, there was a similar growth trend with interest in manga in terms of searches across the population, going up and following a similar trend line. So with all that being said, the top 3 best-selling adult manga titles in 2021 were My Hero Academia Volume 1 by Kohei Horikoshi, Attack on Titan Volume 1 by Hajime Isayama, and My Hero Academia Volume 2. It's interesting to note that all 3 of these titles from these 2 series have been adapted into anime that are currently airing. And they're amongst some of the most popular shows in both the North American and Japanese market. So there's definitely, I think, potential for more research and more examination into the anime and manga tie-ins and how that's affecting the sales information that we're seeing. So over to you, Mo, for our next topic, which is
the environment. Thanks, Hannah. As we all know, the environment and our climate have been popular subjects for a number of years, and 2021 was no exception. While many popular books in the environment category focus on climate change, there are many books on other aspects of our environment that have experienced a growth in popularity as well. There could be lots of reasons for this. In a Ledger poll from midway through 2021, 76% of Canadians indicated that the pandemic has given them a greater appreciation for the outdoors. As a winter lover myself, this is the season that I particularly love the outdoors. Not sure everybody agrees, but it does seem that many Canadians have spent the last 2 years enjoying the environment more than they have before. To take the temperature of Canadian readers' interest in books on climate change, the main subject we look at is nonfiction science, global warming and climate change, which experienced a 137% increase in sales in 2021 over 2020. While global warming and climate change is the first subject you might think of when you're looking for books with environmental themes, they can be found across multiple categories. Others with significant growth include life sciences botany, up 1,757%, earth sciences, meteorology and climatology, which is up 1,067%, and life sciences biology, which is up 36%. On this graph, you can see the relative sizes of these subjects to each other, global warming and climate change being the largest, followed by life sciences biology, life sciences botany, and meteorology and climatology. But all of these subjects are seeing large gains in 2021 over 2020. Like I mentioned, most of the popular titles in this category tend to cover climate change broadly, but there are a number of bestsellers focused on specific elements of the environment and how they impact the broader ecosystem and climate. You can see the impact of those titles on some of the smaller categories here. This might suggest a growing interest in the micro levels of a macro-sized issue. There's a great question from Christina in the chat. Can these increases be attributed to single titles or over many titles? That's a great question. Often there is like a lead bestseller or two bestsellers that are similar within a category, but often it kind of ripples out to other books in the same sort of area or topic. So speaking of macro size things, I wanted to zoom out from those niche categories and look at the top level subjects that most environment books can be found. Books in the science Bizac sold 35% more in 2021 than 2020, and nature titles were up 20%. 2021's top 3 nonfiction titles with environmental themes were How to Avoid a Climate Disaster by Bill Gates, Finding the Mother Tree by Suzanne Simard, and Gathering Moss by Robin Wall Kimmerer. Again, here we're seeing some representation of that narrower focus on particular elements of the environment versus a whole sort of broad climate picture. But these are all books for adults. What's happening with books for young readers, those readers who will be inheriting the impacts of our changing climate? In 2021 compared to 2020, we're seeing lopsided impact in the growth in the science and nature categories between juvenile and YA. While sales of juvenile nonfiction science and nature titles remained flat over 2020, the young adult counterpart of that subject saw growth of 361%. It might look discouraging to see a flat sales figure for these titles in the juvenile category, but something to keep in mind when we think about 2020 is that juvenile nonfiction had a really gangbusters year in 2020. It sold much more than it had in years prior, so that might account for the flat growth. The best-selling juvenile and YA titles on the environment in 2021 were Looking After Our Planet by Katie Danes and illustrated by Ilaria Faccioli, 100 Things to Know About Saving the Planet by various contributors, and How to Change Everything by Naomi Klein with Rebecca Steffoff. But let's not forget about environmental fiction. Not all the things we are interested in the real world have to remain in nonfiction. Sales in the nature and the environment category within fiction were up 680% in 2021, with some bestsellers including The Living Sea of Waking Dreams, The Memoirs of Stockholm Sven, and Chemical Valley. And looking at environment-themed fiction for younger readers in YA and juvenile, they were up 26% over 2020, with bestsellers like Good Night, Little Blue Truck, Thrive, and No More Plastic. Something else to think about with YA and juvenile, and particularly with YA, is that you often see environmental themes come up in other categories like sci-fi, fantasy, and dystopian fiction. So environmental themes are often elsewhere in young adult literature as well, outside of just the nature and the environment categories. So that's all on the environment. I'm going to turn things back over to Hannah.
Thank you, Mo. So the next subject trend that we'd like to highlight is a new category to Bizac, which is own voices. This was added to the Bizac subject code list in the 2020 edition. And so for those of you who aren't familiar, the term own voices was first introduced in September 2015 by author Corinne DeVie as a way to give authentic voices a seat at the table. So Her suggestion was to use hashtag own voices to recommend books about diverse characters written by authors of that same marginalized group. However, since the inception of that hashtag, it's grown to be a larger part of how North American publishing markets authors from historically excluded groups. So the Bizac Code specifically is intended for books about members of historically marginalized groups, written by authors with lived experience in those groups. And own voices is really more of a marketing term than anything else and should only be used with the author's approval and consent. So a little bit different than some of the other Bizac codes we're talking about today. If you want to learn more about own voices as a subject code, you can check out our February 2021 podcast on diversity in the Canadian book industry. And you can also check out our July 2021 webinar on how to sell more books with better Bizac. And this gives some more details on the addition of own voices, some bigger context for that, and what that means to you as a book industry professional. Since the own voices Bizac code was only introduced in 2021, year-over-year percent change can't be calculated because we're calculating against zero. However, we can see the trend in popularity of those titles was really concentrated in the first half of the year. The appropriateness of the own voices term has not been without debate in the industry. The organization We Need Diverse Books decided on June 6th of 2021 not to use the term anymore since it has, quote, been used to place diverse creators in uncomfortable and potentially unsafe situations. This announcement coincides with what we're seeing in this graph as the lowest point in sales for titles with this subject category in 2021. And this is more likely an indication of the books being reassigned to different Bizac codes rather than indicative of a decrease in demand for those titles from readers. And authors have similarly been asking questions about whether identifying themselves as a hashtag own voices author has value or whether it further marginalizes them within the publishing industry. While there are a lot of challenges around the term own voices, the demand for titles that represent a wide variety of lived experiences is consistent across various subjects that we're seeing. Juvenile fiction and nonfiction with the diversity and multicultural subject code saw continued growth throughout 2021. On the fiction side, the diversity and multicultural code increased 47% in 2021, and its nonfiction counterpart increased by a whopping 324% over 2020. The top 3 best-selling juvenile fiction diversity and multicultural titles were It's Okay to Be Different, written by Sharon Purtill and illustrated by Sujata Saha, We Are Family by LeBron James and Andrea Williams, and Our Skin, a first conversation about race by Megan Madison and Jessica Raleigh, illustrated by Isabel Roxas. In order to dive into this a little further, we can turn to BookNet's 2021 Demand for Diversity study, which also offers some useful data. When surveyed about diverse book offerings in the Canadian industry, 84% of readers agreed with the statement that publishers should publish more books by a greater variety of authors. 85% agreed that bookstores or retailers should stock more books by a greater variety. And 86% said the same thing about libraries. In our 2021 Canadian Book Consumer Survey, we saw that of Canadian readers, 86% actively choose to read books with diverse topics and experiences represented. 69% look for stories that represent their own identity and community. 65% read books with characters with immigrant status. 64% with Black, Indigenous, or characters of color. 59% choose to read titles with disabled characters, and 44% read books with LGBTQIA+ characters. So on that last point, I'd like to dive a little deeper into the demand for LGBTQ+ characters and subject matter as we just saw demonstrated. Unsurprisingly, sales data from retailers across Canada demonstrates this interest in reading books with LGBTQ+ characters. In 2021, sales of titles with the fiction/LGBTQ+ Bizac subject increased 152% over 2020. Juvenile fiction increased by 83%, and young adult fiction increased by 119%. So when we combine sales for these three age categories, sales of LGBTQ+ fiction increased 119% in 2021 when compared to 2020. The top 3 best-selling LGBTQ+ fiction titles in 2021 were Johnny Appleseed by Joshua Whitehead, which was also the 2021 Canada Reads winner, Honey Girl by Morgan Rogers, and Boyfriend Material by Alexis Hall. It's interesting to note that of the 3 top-selling titles, only one was published in 2021, Honey Girl. Johnny Appleseed was published in 2018 and Boyfriend Material in 2020. So the award goes into this a little bit, but there's perhaps an opportunity for further research into the popularity of backlist titles when it comes to LGBTQ+ subject codes and the titles that readers are seeking out. Now for the juvenile top titles, they were Rick by Alex Gino, What Are Your Words, written by Catherine Locke and illustrated by Anne Pasha, and Pride Puppy, written by Robin Stevenson and illustrated by Julie McLaughlin, who are both Canadians. For people interested in learning more about the trends in LGBTQ+ fiction, we have an upcoming webinar on March 10th that might be of interest. Nico Saraf and Jennifer Chen from McGill University will join Tech Forum to share insights from their research on queer fan fiction, revealing the stylistic qualities that allow readers to form strong attachments with the material and showing how queer fan fiction authors approach content from a place of emotional vulnerability, explore taboo topics, and offer really character-focused storytelling. So by comparing queer fanfic with books published in the mainstream, Saraf and Chen will highlight how fan fiction normalizes intimacy and emotional vulnerability for sexual and gender minority youth. So if you're interested in the rise of LGBTQ+ subjects codes and want to learn more about queer fanfic, be sure to check this webinar out on March 10th. So that's all for me. Back to you, Mo.
Wow, thanks, Hannah. We were just talking about that webinar before we started this one, and I'm very excited for it. So the next trend I'm going to talk about here is wellness, subjects related to mental wellness, self-improvement, mindfulness, and the like. I think everyone knows someone, or maybe is someone, who may have turned to books in this category over the last 2 years to help weather the ups and downs of pandemic life. 2 of the major wellness categories we're investigating here are nonfiction, body, mind, and spirit, and nonfiction psychology. Body, mind, and spirit is a subject you may not know a ton about. It is a large sort of top-level nonfiction subject that is sometimes colloquially referred to as New Age, and includes subjects ranging from astrology, crystals, mindfulness, parapsychology, spiritualism, and unexplained phenomena. Themes of items in the body, mind, and spirit category tend to include similar themes to titles in psychology and self-help as well. So compared to psychology in terms of the number of ISBNs and the amount of sales, body, mind, and spirit has been sometimes a bit of a smaller category, but it did show 12% growth in 2021 over 2020, while psychology sales for the same period were up 62%. And if we combine those 2 categories into sort of an overall view of wellness, that whole group is up 30%. And often titles in wellness categories are much more popular in the first half of the year because of new year, new you marketing, which I think we've all seen lots of in the last 4 to 6 weeks. How are your resolutions coming along? You can let me know in the chat. But we see this buying trend reflected in the seasonality of the sales. Comparing the first 6 months of 2021, to the first 6 months of 2020, body, mind, and spirit titles are up 27%, and psychology titles in that same time period were up 58%. When we look at the back half of the year, body, mind, and spirit titles were only up 2%, so nearly flat. And psychology had a much larger growth in the back half of the year, 39% over 2020. So some interesting things to keep in mind here with wellness, particularly the way the seasonality impacts body, mind, and spirit more than psychology, and what that might mean for how those books are marketed, especially around this time of year. So diving in on psychology titles, the top titles in 2021 were Atlas of the Heart by Brene Brown, The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, and Jordan B. Peterson's Beyond Order. Keep an eye out for The Body Keeps the Score. We'll be talking about this title again shortly. In the body, mind, and spirit category, the bestsellers tend to include more backlist. So we see titles like The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle, 101 Essays That Will Change the Way You Think by Brianna Wiest, and The Little Book of Mindfulness by Dr. Patricia Collard. While looking at the body, mind, and spirit bestsellers, some of these titles may not be a huge surprise, but what was interesting is that many other items in the top 100 body, mind, and spirit category were tarot decks, oracle cards, and items related to those. We covered the growth in tarot, astrology, and similar topics within body, mind, and spirit in 2020 on our blog. And it seems that that trend is holding true still today. Tarot as a category is up 49% over 2019. So something to keep in mind when you're thinking about what body, mind, and spirit entails and what wellness entails as well. While body, mind, and spirit and psychology are the more common subjects you might think of around wellness, bestsellers in other categories have wellness themes as well. Many bestsellers in nonfiction science, which is up 34% over 2020, have wellness themes, including mental focus and mindfulness, sleep, immune health, etc. Self-help also has significant links to wellness and may be a subject that you were expecting me to mention more in this section. But the category remained fairly stable over 2020, only up 1%. To me, this was a big surprise as someone who looks at the data all the time. Titles with these themes may be appearing in other Bizacs like body, mind, and spirit, psychology, and science. But something to watch if you're looking for titles in self-help, that it doesn't seem as though that's the category in this area where the growth is happening most. So I mentioned that it was a surprise to me that self-help was only up 1%. And I was thinking back to a study we did on our blog in 2019 about the prevalence of swearing in the titles of self-help books. At their peak, self-help titles with swear words in the title accounted for 14% of the books in that category, and that 14% of books accounted for 48% of the sales, so nearly half. When I look at 2021, only 7% of self-help titles had swear words in the title, and they only accounted for 9% of the sales in the category. Many more of the top 100 in self-help now are made up of titles by authors with advanced degrees and experience as academics or practitioners in their fields. We can't say for sure, of course, but it could be that readers are looking for titles by authors with more expertise in their fields. And that's why we're seeing a very small amount of growth in self-help compared to a larger increase of sales in nonfiction psychology, compared to when we look back at that 2018 data. And it seemed like that conversational tough love tone was more appealing to readers at that time. So that's wellness. And we're going to move on to our last trend of today's presentation, and that is book talk. Unlike the other trends we're discussing today, which are mainly subject or theme based, this one is platform based. Book talk is the hashtag most often used on TikTok, where users are sharing short videos about their favorite reads. There's been a lot of attention on the influence of TikTok in the book industry over the last year, particularly how readers on the platform have been creating new audiences for books originally published years ago. So what do we know about trends on book talk? First, let's talk about Gen Z, who make up many of book talk's users. In a YPulse Hobbies and Passions survey, 34% of North American Gen Zs say reading books and ebooks is something they regularly do for pleasure. And reading is in the top 5 ranking of the largest hobbies for their generation, the things they do the most. And books highlighted and frequently discussed on Book Talk span many different genres, from those you might expect to see, like YA fiction, which was up 35% in 2021, romance, which was up 7%, women up 14%, science fiction up 27%, and fairy tales, folk tales, legends, and mythology up 49%. Those topics might be the types of books you expect to see significant growth on a platform like TikTok. Then we see some other subjects that we may not initially see as something that would be popular on social media. Subjects like historical fiction, which are frequently mentioned on TikTok, but have just a small amount of growth, just 1%. Self-help and personal growth, a similar kind of wellness category, was flat over the previous year, but is mentioned frequently on Book Talk. And then we also have literary fiction. There are a number of literary fiction titles that are popular on TikTok, but we saw actually a decrease in sales in that Bizac category over 2020. Something to keep in mind when you're thinking about a Bizac category like literary is that there are probably many more literary books that are just not categorized in the fiction literary Bizac, because it may be in another Bizac that aligns more closely with the actual content of the book versus a Bizac like this, which is more about the style. But then when we look at book talk subjects, we get into what I'm calling the oddballs, the books you may not expect to see trending on social media with young readers. We get categories like organizational behavior, which is up 71% over 2020, and post-traumatic stress disorder, which was up 162%. I mentioned The Body Keeps the Score in the wellness section of this presentation, and we're seeing an interest in that title on Book Talk as well, which has contributed to the growth in this generally quite small category. And while none of the major Book Talk picks that I've mentioned, especially those outlier oddball subjects, which are nonfiction, none of those are in young adult nonfiction Bizacs. They're all in the standard nonfiction Bizac. The YA nonfiction Bizac has grown 20% since 2019, suggesting there's a growing appetite for nonfiction geared towards teen and YA audiences. So there may be something to learn from the other nonfiction picks we're seeing on Book Talk. As the YA nonfiction category grows and new books or adult nonfiction books are adapted for younger readers in this category, perhaps it's worth exploring if there's a YA audience for some more non-traditional picks, like titles in your business or psychology backlist that might adapt well for young adult readers who are keen to understand more about their psychology and mental health or prepare for careers in a changing world. Something to consider as we look at some of these stranger picks that are bubbling up on TikTok. And speaking of backlists, last year we ran a study looking at backlist sales and found, I don't know why my slide took so long to readjust, but here we are. We looked at backlist sales and broke out the sales of backlist titles across different pub date ranges. And we found that books that were between 2 and 5 years old, so 2 to 5 years after their pub date, sold better than any other backlist age band category. And it does seem that many backlist book talk hits fall into that 2 to 5 year category. So there's just something about 2 to 5 years that seems to age the book just right, like a fine wine, that makes it sort of primed for a new audience again. So as we look at what categories are bubbling up on TikTok or some of the other categories we've talked about today, it might be worth reviewing your backlist items and inventory for books in that 2 to 5 year age band that align with the subjects you're seeing grow over time. Your mid and backlist may have a second life on our favorite short video platform. And if you're keen to hear more about book talk from somebody who is a real book talker, and probably more with it than I am, we're hosting a book talk panel as part of our Tech Forum series in just a few weeks on February 17th. You can register at techforum.booknetcanada.ca, and I'm sure my fine colleagues will have put that link in the chat as well. You can attend that session and learn more about this dynamic and influential platform and the readers who are using it to share their love of reading and market books. If you liked this session, we at BookNet produce tons of research content, nearly all of which is available for free, covering Canadians' reading, buying, and borrowing behavior, subject trends, and so much more. So if you're interested in more research, that's a great place to start. But we are here for your questions now, and we are always keen to hear your questions and things you'd like us to look at further via email. So our email address is on the slide, and we'll leave it up as we dive into some questions. But thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Mo. So yeah, let's turn to the questions that have come in from attendees. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat box or the Q&A panel as we're going. But I'll get started. So the first question is for you, Mo, asking, when coming to the stats on the environment, can you give us a hint as to where these books are selling? Most indies and Indigo seem to have a tough time selling environmental books beyond the obvious bestsellers.
That's a great question. I don't know off the top of my head in terms of retail channel where environment books tend to be selling more. That might be something we can consider looking at for a blog post or a future deeper dive on the environment.
Mm-hmm. I think it might be possible, sort of like you talked about with wellness, where some of the titles that see a lot of movement and are popular are not an obvious Bizac subjects, right? Like I think that is possibly likely in that category as well.
Yeah, the stats we saw on the botany, and the botany one in particular, had a lot of interesting titles and unexpected bestsellers compared to, you know, I would expect to see bestsellers in more general categories.
Definitely. Another question, can you give a sense of the percentage ratio of sales in these top categories in terms of Canadian published, Canadian authored compared to internationally published, internationally authored? So basically how are Canadian publishers stacking up in terms of these trends? I can initially speak to this and say, again, we don't have the data on hand. We have access to that information and could do more investigation. I think it would be really interesting to see where we're seeing particularly Canadian contributors making movement. Do you have anything more to say to that, Mo?
Yeah, I would say it's going to be very different in some categories than others, just based on, I would say, particularly with environment, I think a lot of those books tend to have regional interests, particularly those smaller categories I mentioned, like botany. A lot of them are very focused on like regional climates, ecosystems, and plant life. So there are likely more sort of categories there that would see regional and local published and authorship information, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, our colleague Noah is mentioning the CBM, the Canadian Book Market Study, which comes out in March, does show some Canadian publisher and authorship information in different subject categories. So that's a great place to start.
Mm-hmm. Next question. Do we have any data on the growth of print books versus ebooks? This is a great question because I think that we both neglected to mention that we're looking exclusively at print book sales. So for the past 40 minutes, so thank you for flagging that. Yeah, so what we're looking at today is just print books. Definitely there's potential to do research more into ebook sales and how those are comparing and moving. I think another opportunity as well that we didn't cover here, just because we wanted to limit the scope, is how these subject codes are performing in libraries, looking at circulation data and loans, and if we're seeing similar trends and patterns in readers who are borrowing the books versus those who are buying them.
Yes, there's definitely lots to explore further in the library circulation data that we have access to.
Mm-hmm. Next one. Thank you so much, by the way, everyone. These are excellent questions. Is there a way to study year-over-year change in market share for each Bizac rather than year-over-year change in unit sales? Mo, do you want to take this one?
I do, sure. There absolutely is within the sales data reporting platform. You can compare each of these by their market share. So you can see, you know, a small subject can have a large amount of growth. For example, if a small subject had 3,000% market growth or not market share growth over the previous year. You know, if it's a change from one book to 3,000 books, that's maybe less relevant than if it's a change from 10,000 books to hundreds of thousands of books. But that information is available in, again, that Canadian Book Market Study and on the sales data reporting platform as well.
Mm-hmm. And I will call out as well, sort of again, pulling back the curtain to what we were doing with this webinar. We were mindful of thinking of things like that point that Mo just brought up. Is it an increase in ISBNs that's statistically significant? And also looking at if it's a particular ISBN that's really moving the needle, or if this is actually a trend in terms of a larger number of titles and that sort of thing. This is a question just for you, Mo, again, related to your environment section. Have we seen a rise in gardening Bizacs, especially since gardening was such a huge topic in the beginning of the pandemic? I don't know if we have that data to hand or not. We've done a couple deep dives into sort of pandemic topics and
yeah, that's a great question. We did cover growth in indoor gardening specifically on our blog a while ago, probably around the beginning of indoor gardening and home plants as a trend. It would probably be worth another look and expanding out to more gardening categories, because I know as we sort of implied at the beginning of the environment section, more people were spending time outside and maybe fully attempting a garden for the first time over the last 2 years, and maybe we'll see that reflected in the sales data as well.
Mm-hmm. Another environment one. That one's most popular, manga job. Um, do you have a sense of whether some of the books experiencing growth are field guides for bird watching, plant foraging, et cetera, or is it mainly narrative nonfiction? I don't know. Did you come across any of that when you were looking specifically at the titles, at the
It's
title level within these
interesting.
subjects?
The thing about some of these titles and the fact that they're kind of everything's being segmented by one Bizac for our research purposes. So there may be a few guides to birdwatching, for example, in some of those environment categories, but activities and hobbies and some of the other categories might be places where more of those books live. And there are similar categories where I'm trying to remember where foraging is, if it's in cooking or if it's somewhere else. So some of them might be in environment type categories within science, but then they may also be in activity or hobby-based Bizacs elsewhere in the code list. It just depends where that primary subject has been placed, where it sort of ends up for those books that tend to straddle multiple areas.
Mhm. Yeah, and it can take a little bit of Bizac detective work to get to those codes also, because there's so much subjectivity also in how publishers assign them and how they're used. So yeah,
Yeah.
very interesting.
Yeah, I did definitely see at least one or two of those sort of field guide, or for lack of a better term, like do it yourself sort of manuals, but there is much more in the science categories in particular. They're much more focused on more of a narrative and less of an instructional, if that makes sense.
Mhm. Yeah, Don Gorman also made an interesting comment in the chat. Thank you, saying it could also include regional guidebooks, sort of as part of that.
Depending on whether they've been in the travel Bizacs or in the nature and the environment Bizacs.
So that seems to be it for the questions from the chat. I have a question for you, actually, Mo.
Wow, okay.
When I know, should I have asked you before we went on? No, maybe. But my question is, when we were doing this research, looking at these subject trends, were there any either that you shared today or that you didn't have a chance to share where you thought like, wow, I would love to have the chance to actually spend time and really dig deep into this? Anywhere where you think there's opportunity for more research and maybe a deeper dive into what's going on in that subject category?
I think, not to talk about the environment again, but there is something interesting happening in the young adult and juvenile environment books, especially with the changes that were made to the subjects list recently to include subjects around activism and social justice. Is I think a lot of those environment books are actually moving into those activism categories, because a lot of books for younger audiences are focused on, what actions can you take, what are the issues around climate change, and they might be moving into those categories, which might affect some of the growth that we've seen in the data we have now, because those changes to the Bizacs only happened quite recently. So it would be interesting to see, this time next year, if the sales in those activism and social justice categories are higher and the environment ones are lower because the books have changed category.
That's really interesting. And I saw a similar thing when I was looking at diversity and multicultural in the juvenile and young adult subject categories, how juvenile fiction, the social themes, which is another kind of more general, all encompassing category, that has seen huge growth. And it's kind of hard to narrow down what it is specifically, because that could encompass things like issues about injustice, systemic injustice, but also can be things like bullying for juvenile readers. So that's very interesting.
Yeah.
I think for me, yeah, go ahead.
No, you go.
Oh, I was just going to say, for me to answer my own question, I am always interested in seeing more manga research. And I know our colleague Lynn did an excellent blog post about sort of the changes we've seen in manga and the real skyrocketing growth. But I think that's such a large part of the market and something that we haven't explored as much. And there's a lot of opportunity to kind of get more into that, look more at the different subsets, different genres within that. And I'd love to see more of that. So that's my
Yeah,
answer to my own question.
it's so fascinating. There's so much to learn from all this information and so many rows of our spreadsheet we couldn't fit into this one presentation.
That's such a horrifying, wonderful spreadsheet.
Yeah.
Well, I think with that, thank you so much, Mo. It was great hearing what you had to share today and talking with you about subjects. I could do this for
Thank
hours.
you, Hannah.
And thank you everybody else, to all the attendees for joining us for this presentation. Before we go, we'd love if you could give some feedback on the webinar and the registration process. We'll drop a link to that survey in the chat. If you have a couple minutes to fill it out, that helps us tremendously. And we'll also be emailing you a link to a recording of this session as soon as it's available. Yes. And finally, I'd like to thank the Department of Canadian Heritage for their support through the Canada Book Fund.
And if you have further questions about subject trends or hunches about trends you'd like us to explore further, our email address is salesdata@booknetcanada.ca. We're always looking for new things to bust out our detective skills on.
Inbox is always open. Oh yeah.
Always.
So thanks so much, everybody. I will release you to the rest of your day. Take care all.
Bye, everyone.